Hey everyone, and welcome to part 3 in the series of supercharging your Kubernetes deployments with Flux v2 and GitHub. In part 1, we looked at the basics, what is Flux v2 and what are the components. And in part 2, we took a short detour to look at Kustomize. And we'll use what we learned about Kustomize in this section that deals with deploying to Kubernetes with plain YAML manifests. You have to know a little bit about the repositories we are going to use in the example. We have a Flux infra repo, and that's the one that is used with Bootstrapping. So it contains a Flux system folder, and the Flux system folder contains all the YAML files that we need to deploy Flux v2. And automatically the bootstrap command is putting these files in that Flux system folder. In that folder, we'll also create custom resources such as sources that point to our YAML files and kustomizations that tell Flux v2 how to deploy these YAML files. Of course, we do need a repository to hold our YAML files as well. That's the repo called real-time app infra. It contains a deploy folder with a base and overlays, just as we explained in the previous video that was about Kustomize. And of course, when we create our sources in our Flux infra repository, they will refer to the real-time app infra repo, because of course that's where we save our sources. Yes, I've chosen here to separate these repositories. That makes it clear how these all work together. And actually, there is another repo, that's the real-time app repo, that actually contains the application that we are deploying. It contains our app that's written in Go in a folder called app, and it also contains a GitHub action that builds and pushes our container. Let's take a look at that Flux infra repo. The Flux infra repo contains indeed this app cluster folder. The Flux system folder contains all the YAML files that deploy Flux to our cluster. The bootstrap command took care of that. And then we have in the same folder, the app cluster folder, we have all kinds of YAML files here. This one already has all the files that we need to deploy the application to our cluster. For example, I have a source. The source is just a YAML file that points to, indeed, the real-time app infra repo. That's a source that contains the YAML files for our applications. If we go to the app cluster folder again, you'll then find that there's a real-time app dev and a real-time app production YAML. If I check the real-time app dev YAML, you see here that this is a customization, and we tell Flux v2 to deploy our YAML files using the base overlay technique. And we point to the overlay for dev that we'd like to deploy. So that's basically what the Flux infra repo looks like. And here we have the real-time app infra repository, the second one we looked at in that slide earlier. This one contains a deploy folder and of course the base and the overlays. Just quickly look at the kustomization.yaml file in here. You'll see this is the base YAML file. We just pointed the resources we'd like to deploy. Real-time YAML is the application. Redis is the backend that the application requires. Now, if you looked at the previous video about Kustomize, you know that this real-time YAML actually contains variables. And we define these variables here, Redis service and Redis namespace, at this level using the vars capability of Kustomize. If you don't know exactly what that is, look at the previous video in this series and you'll understand what this actually does. This is the base. So if we go to our deploy folder and then look at the overlays, we have two overlays for dev and for production. The idea is that we deploy our application in dev and production, and in this case we do that on the same cluster. So of course in the dev overlay we have to specify that we want to deploy to a specific namespace. The namespace is real-time dev in the case of the dev overlay. And of course our kustomization.yaml will reflect that. We specify the namespace over here. We also set a suffix for all the names that we deploy, or the names of our resources. And we refer to our resources using /basis real-time app. Be aware, in the previous video, I actually used basis, but basis is deprecated. You should also use resources, also in your overlays. Now, in development, I'd like to have only one replica of my real-time deployment. Because it's development, I don't need more than that. And with images, I specify the image I want in development. Now, currently, this is set to a SHA tag that is generated by our Azure, GitHub action. I almost said Azure DevOps pipeline, but it's a GitHub action that we used here to set that. And you'll see later how that works. For the production overlay, it's of course very similar, but do know I did one thing different here. In production, I also wanted to set my requests equal to the limits in the real-time deployment. The limits are 150 for both CPU and memory. So with a patch strategic merge option, using an inline patch instead of a patch in a file, I can basically override the requests in the base here. In production, I'd like to have 3 replicas. You'll see later how that works. And production also uses a release or a tag that we set at the GitHub level. We are now ready to bootstrap the cluster with the Flux bootstrap command based on a GitHub repo. Other providers are of course supported. I have set my environment variable GitHub user, as we have seen in the first episode in this series, and I have also set an environment variable for my GitHub token. Of course, Flux needs that to access my repository with read-write credentials. And I'm going to use the repository called Flux infra. And as you have seen before, that already contains Flux components that will deploy my dev and my production environment to my cluster. The cluster I'm using now is a cluster running on Azure. It's using, of course, AKS. And I've listed the namespaces over here. As you can see, this is a default cluster. Nothing has been deployed to it yet, a default namespace, and it is empty. Let's start the bootstrap. So we connect to GitHub. It clones the existing repository to our system, generates manifests in the Flux system namespace, or overrides what is there already. And by the way, the Flux bootstrap command is idempotent, so you can run this as many times as you want. And of course, now he's deploying all the different controllers to my system. So normally, if we are checking our namespaces, we should see that there's a Flux system namespace now. The Flux system namespace contains all the controllers and all the other configuration that Flux v2 requires. So while we are waiting for that deployment to be successful, what now will happen is we'll start also to sync manifests, including the manifests that I added that deploy my dev and my production environment. He's stating now that he's waiting for cluster sync. If I'm running the kgetns command again, you will also see that I now get my real-time dev and my real-time PRD namespaces, as was defined in my kustomizations. What I can also do is I can use the Flux get kustomizations command to see what is going on there. And as I can see, I have a couple of kustomizations, but the reconciliation is still in progress. We'll see in a moment what happens there, because of course we just deployed our components. My components have health checks. You'll see later how these health checks are defined. And when Flux sees that my deployments or other components I deployed are healthy, he will normally report that the revision is healthy. So we're still busy and I will just make it a little bit smaller. We are still busy with real-time, that is finished. Real-time app dev is finished. Ready is true. real-time app PRD is still busy, so still in progress. We'll wait a while for that. And I also have some monitoring components, Grafana, etc. is being installed. That is also still busy. Let's run Flux get kustomizations again. And now we see that everything has been deployed neatly to our cluster. Maybe important to know is that Flux also has a sync command. So if you run Flux, you'll see that there is a, well, sync, it's a reconcile command. So if I run Flux reconcile, you will see that you can reconcile, for instance, a customization. And I have a customization which is called real-time app dev, for instance. So if I want to synchronize this real-time app dev manually, I don't want to wait for the built-in refresh to happen. I can just run this command and start a reconciliation myself. What you have just seen is bootstrapping a cluster from an existing repository that already contained all the sources and customizations to deploy my dev and my production environment. But what do you do to create this from scratch? So what I did now is I removed all Flux components from my cluster. You can use Flux uninstall for that. It's easy to do. My namespaces are just back to what they were in the beginning. And I can now do Flux Bootstrap again, but I will use a completely new repository. And as you know, if the repository does not exist, he will create it on GitHub. Let's do that. And let's bootstrap the cluster based on this new repo. As you can see there, the repository was created, then cloned, and of course now the manifests are generated again, and all the components are installed on the system. That shouldn't take too long. When that is finished, we're coming back to install or configure our sources. Great, the bootstrap command has finished. I'm now going to clone the repo scratch infra that was just created to my local system. So let's do that, and maybe I should put git clone in front of that. I'm going to leave this in because these are typical things that happen. I'm going to do a git clone here. This one doesn't know my username and password yet, so I'm going to just fill this in here, and the cloning can happen. Let's clear this out. Let's do ls and let's go into scratch infra. Of course, this is empty. It just has a readme.md and an app cluster. What I want to do now is I want to create a source. The source is created with the flux create source command. In this case, it is a git source, so a git repo, and I'm going to give it the name real-time app infra. As you have seen in the slides before, the sources, so our YAML files with all the customizations and so forth, are in a repository, a separate one called real-time app infra. Now what you see here is I also set a branch, which is master in this case, not main, and also an interval to check the source at regular intervals. Now I'm not creating the source directly on the cluster. What I'm doing is I'm exporting the result of this to a file in my app cluster folder called real-time app source YAML. Let's just do that and then go inside the app cluster folder. There we can see the real-time app source, and of course this will reflect what we have used on the command line. You see this is a resource of kind git repository, and of course we point to our URL there. So we need this, or Flux v2 needs this to know where the sources are we want to customize. So let's clear this out, and I'm now going to add back first to my cluster above, my folder above app cluster. I want to clear this out again, and now I'm going to add a customization. I pasted the customization to my command line, or the command to create a customization, and this is similar to creating the source. We're going to export this to a file in my app cluster folder. So here we create a customization, we give the customization a name, and of course we have to refer to a source. Where are the source file? Where do I find my base and my overlays? And this customization is responsible for deploying the dev environment. So we need to point to the dev overlay. I'm not going to go over all the different options here. You can find them also in the documentation, but of course the health checks are important. The health checks point in this case to the two deployments I'm doing with this customization. And we use the health check equals and then the type that you want to check, a deployment. And then this is the name of the deployment, so real-time dev. And after that, dot namespace. Of course, I'm using the suffixes in my customizations, so I must be sure I also use the suffixes that are the result, or the names that are the result of the suffixes that are in my customization. So this should be enough to create the customization YAML file. And what I will also do, so I don't have to do this in a separate step afterwards, I'm going to already create the customization for the production environment as well. That's the same thing. So I'm just going to copy and paste or copy the value from my notes here, paste it in here. So it's just the same, but this is my production deployment. The production, of course, uses a different overlay, the PRD overlay. For the rest, it's all the same, but of course, we also refer to the deployments in my real-time-PRD namespace. Let's run this. That means we now have, if we go to app cluster, we now have 2 extra files over there. I'm just going to check one of the customizations so you can see what is in there. So if I cut out the real-time app and I'll use the dev.yaml, there you see a resource of kind customization. It has, of course, the name and the namespace as well. They are indeed saved in Flux system. And when I put on the command line, the health checks, the path to my overlay and so forth, that is all reflected within this file over here. Now, this is of course great, but I'm working on my local system. So if I'm checking my Git status, I have these files locally, but I'd like to, of course, add them to my repository over here, over on GitHub. Now, be aware that I already bootstrapped my cluster. So from the moment that I commit these files to the Bootstrap repository, Flux will kick in and, of course, start with the deployment of these environments. So let's just do this. Let's just add all these files. Let's do a git commit, give it a commit message, edit source and customizations, right? So we've committed that, and now we do a git push to that repo. I'll give my name over there, and then I will also type in the token. Yeah, for some reason I didn't save this yet, but that's okay. We'll just type it in now for this demo. And now we have pushed that to the repo. We can clear this out, and what I can do here is I can do a watch on Flux get customizations. So let's do so. Flux get customizations and watch this. As you can see now, he has seen that there are 2 customizations added, the real-time app dev customization and the real-time app PRD customization. But they're not ready yet. Reconciliation is in progress. Now you see already that PRD is ready and dev is now ready as well. That means that if I run kgetns here, kgetns, you will see that I have my 2 namespaces there, real-time dev and real-time PRD. Let's clear this out and let's run k9s to take a look at what was actually deployed on my cluster. We go to all namespaces using 0, and let's check out the dev container. Here we have the real-time dev container. We use D to describe it, and as you'll see, this one is using the image with a short SHA tag over there, right? Let's escape. Let's go out of this and go to our production environment. And as you can see there in production, we have 3 containers running, not just one container. If we describe this one, you see that that one is using the semantic version, the last one we have, which is 1.0.1. Great, that means that the pods were deployed successfully in my development and in my production namespace. And that's all the result of having a source and 2 customizations added to my Bootstrap repository. So what actually got deployed? What you see in front of you is the real-time application, which is a very simple sample application in the dev namespace with a lighter color. In the production namespace, so production version 1.0.1 is using this, let's say, a little bit uglier color. What I'd like to do now is to get production equal to what we have in development. And we're using a simple way to do so. In this case, as an example, we will use a release on the level of GitHub. So I have my releases here. And by the way, this is a release in my application repository. So the repo that contains my Go code. I'm going to draft a new release here. And when I draft a new release, I can of course select the version. I'm going to type 1.0.2, publish the release. So a new release now got deployed. What happens now is that a GitHub action will kick in. So you can see that here we have all kinds of GitHub actions run that already were run in the past. I have my best colors ever here, which triggers a new build of my container. Of course, the container build takes a while, but it's now finished. And as you can see, a tag was being used for my container image, which is 1.0.2, which nicely matches the tag that I just created in my GitHub repo. Now, of course, we have to update in some way the customization that is deploying our application in production. How we do that, or how we do it in this case, is to run another task when the build stage has completed successfully. And there we basically clone the real-time app infra repo and we run customize edit. You haven't seen the customize edit command in the previous video that I made, but with customize edit, I can basically modify my kustomization.yaml from the command line. And what I do here is I set the image in the customization to, of course, /fluxrt, and then using GitHub ref there, I extract the tag, which is 1.0.2, and I append that to the image name as the image tag. Then we just add that to the real-time app infra, we commit that, and we push that. Yeah, so that's all there is to it to update our customization. Let's check the customization. We are now inside the kustomization.yaml file that we just modified from our GitHub action. And as you can see, the images section in the kustomization.yaml now has, for the image /fluxrt, has a new tag of 1.0.2. This, of course, will ensure that when Flux v2 does reconciliations, it will see this, it will run a new customization, of course, to deploy 1.0.2 in production. Let's check that out. We're now back in K9s, and Flux already had enough time to do reconciliations. So you see there, I'm on the real-time PRD namespace on one of the containers of the app. When I do a describe over there, you can see that it now is using the 1.0.2 image. That should have the same color as in development. Let's take a quick look. Here's my application in production, still with that green color. And remember, in development, we had this blue background. Let's hope this works and refresh the application. And as you can see, in production, the color is now the same because we're using 1.0.2, which matches the latest revision that we applied in development. We've come to the end of this video, so we have seen how to bootstrap a cluster with already existing sources and customizations in it. Then we bootstrapped our cluster with an empty repo and we added a source and 2 customizations for development and production. And then we checked out how we update the image in production. In this case, we were just using an example that uses a tag on the GitHub level. Now, for a next video, we're going to focus on the last step, which is the monitoring and alerting step. So we'll see how to do monitoring with Prometheus and Grafana, and we'll also see how we can send events to Slack or Teams to see what Flux v2 is doing. So stay tuned for that next video. Hope to see you then. Bye bye.